War is no longer announced. There are no declarations, no clear enemies, no victory parades. Yet wars are happening everywhere. Nations are collapsing, governments are falling, millions are dying, and the most powerful countries in the world claim they are not at war. History shows that when empires fear direct confrontation, they choose a darker path, a war fought through others. This is the story of proxy wars, the most dangerous weapon empires use when they want power without responsibility. Throughout history, the most devastating wars were not always the loudest. Some wars were never declared, never officially acknowledged, and never truly ended. Proxy wars belong to this hidden category of conflict. They exist in the space between peace and open war, allowing empires to destroy rivals without ever pulling the trigger themselves. In a proxy war, power hides behind distance. Weapons are supplied quietly, money flows through invisible channels, and political influence replaces armies. To the outside world, these conflicts appear local, chaotic, or accidental. But behind the scenes, they are carefully managed struggles between far greater forces. Empires learned early that perception matters more than truth. Declaring war invites resistance, unity among enemies, and accountability at home. Fighting indirectly avoids all three. Proxy wars allow empires to claim innocence while shaping outcomes. They can deny involvement when atrocities occur and take credit when victories are achieved. This form of warfare is not an exception in history, it is the rule. From ancient empires to modern superpowers, proxy wars have been the preferred method of conflict whenever direct confrontation became too risky. Empires do not avoid direct war because they are weak. They avoid it because they understand its cost. Every major empire that engaged in prolonged direct conflict eventually paid a price far greater than it expected. Direct wars drain economies, fracture societies, and expose leadership to failure. As empires grow larger, their vulnerability increases. A single defeat can shatter the illusion of invincibility that holds an empire together. Proxy wars solve this problem. They allow empires to fight continuously, without mobilizing their populations or risking total collapse. Soldiers do not return home in body bags. Cities are not bombed on the homeland. The war remains distant, abstract, and manageable. Empires can escalate or de-escalate involvement at will, adjusting support depending on political needs. This flexibility makes proxy wars far more attractive than open conflict. History shows that when empires reach their most dangerous phase, when they feel threatened but still powerful, proxy wars become their primary weapon.
Proxy wars are often seen as a modern invention, but their roots stretch deep into ancient history. The Roman Empire rarely fought every enemy directly. Instead, it manipulated rival tribes, supported client kings, and funded internal rebellions to weaken opponents before stepping in. Rome understood that chaos was often more effective than conquest. By keeping enemies divided, Rome ensured that no single force could challenge its dominance. The Persian Empire used similar strategies, playing Greek city-states against one another while conserving its own military strength. Even ancient China practiced indirect warfare, using buffer states and regional allies to absorb pressure from rivals. These early empires recognized a fundamental truth. Controlling outcomes matters more than controlling territory. Proxy warfare allowed them to shape the political landscape without exhausting their own resources. One of the greatest advantages of proxy warfare is the use of local forces. Local actors understand the terrain, culture, language, and social dynamics far better than foreign armies ever could. Empires exploit this knowledge by empowering factions that align with their interests. These groups fight with passion, believing they are defending their own future, while the empire supplying them remains safely removed from the battlefield. However, this strategy comes with long-term consequences. Proxy forces rarely remain loyal forever. Once armed and empowered, they develop ambitions of their own. History is filled with examples of proxy groups turning against their sponsors or destabilizing entire regions long after the original conflict ends. Empires often underestimate this risk, believing short-term gains outweigh future instability. This miscalculation has repeatedly accelerated imperial decline. The British Empire did not rule the world through sheer military strength alone. It ruled through influence, manipulation, and carefully managed proxy systems. Britain relied heavily on local rulers, colonial administrations, and regional militias to enforce its will. Rather than governing directly, it governed through intermediaries. This allowed Britain to control vast territories with a relatively small military presence. Divide and rule became a defining feature of British imperial strategy. By encouraging rivalries between ethnic, religious, and political groups, Britain ensured that resistance remained fragmented. Proxy conflicts kept regions unstable, but controllable. While this approach extended the life of the empire, it also left behind deep fractures that persisted long after British withdrawal. Many modern conflicts trace their origins to these imperial proxy strategies. The Cold War marked the peak of proxy warfare. Two superpowers, armed with weapons capable of destroying the planet, avoided direct confrontation while fighting relentlessly across the globe. Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East became battlefields not of their own choosing, but of global rivalry. Local conflicts were transformed into prolonged wars fueled by foreign money, weapons, and ideology. For the superpowers, proxy wars were strategic chess moves. For the countries caught in between, they were catastrophic. Entire generations grew up in conflict zones, shaped by distant decisions made in foreign capitals. The Cold War proved that proxy wars could be just as deadly as direct wars, and far more difficult to end. Proxy wars are dangerous precisely because they lack clear boundaries. There are no formal rules, no clear beginnings, and no decisive endings. Responsibility is blurred, making accountability almost impossible. Empires can deny involvement, prolong conflicts indefinitely, and shift blame onto local actors. This creates a cycle of violence that feeds on itself. History shows that proxy wars often outlast the empires that started them. Long after sponsors withdraw, the weapons remain, the divisions deepen, and instability becomes permanent. Proxy wars do not simply fight battles. They reshape societies. They destroy trust, weaken institutions, and leave nations vulnerable to future manipulation. In the long run, proxy wars harm not only the victims, but the empires that rely on them.
Proxy wars are rarely fought on the land of those who design them. They are fought in smaller nations, weaker states, and divided societies that become battlegrounds for forces far larger than themselves. These nations are told they are fighting for independence, security, or ideology, but history reveals a harsher truth. They are fighting for the interests of others. Infrastructure is destroyed, economies collapse, and entire generations grow up knowing nothing but instability. When the proxy war ends, the sponsors move on, but the damage remains. What makes proxy wars especially destructive is that they hollow nations from the inside. Institutions weaken, trust disappears, and violence becomes normalized. Even after the fighting slows, the country remains fractured, unable to rebuild properly. Proxy wars do not simply end conflicts, they freeze societies in a permanent state of crisis. This is why regions touched by proxy wars often experience decades of instability long after global attention fades. Empires often believe they can control proxy wars. History shows they are wrong. Once weapons are distributed and power is delegated, control begins to slip. Local actors pursue their own goals, alliances shift, and conflicts evolve beyond their original purpose. What began as a controlled strategy becomes a chaotic force. Empires respond by increasing involvement, sending more money, more weapons, and more influence, deepening the conflict rather than resolving it. This loss of control is one of the most dangerous aspects of proxy warfare. It creates unintended consequences that ripple outward, destabilizing entire regions. Refugee crises, economic shocks, and political radicalization spread far beyond the original battlefield. Proxy wars have a habit of growing larger than the empires that started them, dragging sponsors into deeper involvement they initially sought to avoid.
History shows a clear pattern. Empires rely on proxy wars most heavily during the early stages of decline. When direct dominance becomes too costly and legitimacy begins to erode, indirect control feels safer. But this reliance is a warning sign, not a solution. Proxy wars mask weakness rather than resolving it. They drain resources quietly, create moral contradictions, and expose hypocrisy. At home, citizens grow confused and divided. Abroad, allies grow cautious and rivals grow bolder. The Roman Empire experienced this phase as it increasingly relied on mercenaries and client states. The British Empire used proxy rule extensively as it struggled to maintain global control. modern superpowers show similar patterns. Proxy wars allow empires to delay collapse, but they also accelerate the loss of credibility and cohesion that ultimately brings decline.
At a certain point, empires become trapped by proxy warfare. Having avoided direct confrontation for so long, they lose the ability to act decisively. Every move must be indirect, deniable, and politically safe. This limits options and creates paralysis. Rivals learn to exploit this hesitation, pushing boundaries while staying just below the threshold of open war. The empire reacts constantly, but never resolves the underlying problem. This strategic trap is dangerous because it erodes confidence both at home and abroad. Allies begin to doubt the empire's reliability. Enemies test its limits. The empire still possesses immense power, but no longer knows how to use it effectively. History shows that this moment, when power exists without clarity, is often the beginning of the end.
Proxy wars are often justified as cost-effective alternatives to direct war. But history shows they rarely produce true winners. Even when an empire achieves short-term objectives, the long-term consequences outweigh the gains. Regions destabilized by proxy wars become sources of future conflict. Former proxies turn into adversaries. Moral authority is lost, replaced by cynicism and distrust. Empires that rely heavily on proxy wars find themselves managing endless crises rather than shaping a stable world. The illusion of control fades, replaced by constant firefighting. Proxy wars do not solve problems, they postpone them, and postponed problems, history shows, tend to return with greater force. Across centuries and civilizations, history delivers the same lesson. Indirect war is a sign of fear, not strength. Empires choose proxy wars when they no longer trust their own stability. They are attempts to maintain influence without risking collapse. But history is unforgiving. Every empire that relied too heavily on indirect control eventually faced the consequences. Internal decay accelerated, legitimacy eroded, and rivals adapted. The pattern is clear. Proxy wars increase when empires feel threatened. They peak during moments of uncertainty, and they fade only after the empire itself begins to withdraw from the global stage. The battlefield shifts, but the outcome remains consistent.
The modern world is entering a new phase. Power is no longer concentrated in a single empire. Multiple great powers compete simultaneously, increasing the likelihood of proxy conflicts. As direct war becomes unthinkable, indirect war becomes inevitable. Proxy wars will shape the future not because they are effective, but because they are politically convenient. However, history also suggests that proxy wars become less controllable in multipolar systems. With more players involved, conflicts become more complex, alliances more fragile, and outcomes more unpredictable. The risk is no longer just regional instability, it is global fragmentation. The future may belong not to the strongest empire, but to the one that understands when not to fight at all. Proxy wars reveal the true nature of power. They expose the fears of empires, the vulnerability of small nations, and the fragility of global order. These wars are fought quietly, justified carefully, and forgotten quickly, yet their consequences last for generations. History shows that proxy wars are not signs of strategic brilliance, but symptoms of a system under strain. When empires stop fighting openly, it is not because the world has become peaceful. It is because the cost of truth has become too high. And when wars are hidden, accountability disappears. The greatest danger of proxy wars is not the destruction they cause abroad, but the decay they accelerate at home. Empires do not fall on battlefields alone. They fall in the shadows, fighting wars they refuse to name.